June 14, 1940. Abbeville, northern France. The Stuka dive bomber screamed down through broken cloud at nearly 300 miles per hour, its fixed landing gear creating the distinctive wail that had become the soundtrack of German blitzkrieg. On the ground below, French infantry scattered like insects as the aircraft pulled out of its dive at 800 feet, releasing a single 500-pound bomb that turned a stone bridge into rubble and memory. Captain Pierre Dufour watched from a ditch 200 meters away, his hands pressed over his ears against the concussion, dirt raining down on his helmet. The bridge had been their last withdrawal route across the Somme. Now it was gone, and 32 men were cut off behind German lines with no ammunition resupply and no way home. 3 weeks earlier, Dufour had commanded an anti-aircraft battery outside Sedan with 6 25mm guns and a fire control system that could theoretically track aircraft at 20,000 feet. The system had performed exactly as designed during training exercises. Against the Stukas, it had been worthless. The German dive bombers came in too fast, too steep, their approach angles changing second by second in ways that made predictive fire control impossible. His guns had fired 700 rounds over 2 days of fighting. They had damaged 1 aircraft, possibly 2. The Stukas had destroyed his entire battery position, killed 18 of his men, and forced the survivors to retreat on foot. The French military had studied German tactical innovations throughout the 1930s with the careful attention of professionals who understood their next war would be fought against this enemy. They had observed the Legion Condor operations in Spain, analyzed the Polish campaign, reviewed intelligence reports from attaches in Berlin. The reports had been clear and consistent. German armor operated in concentrated formations with close air support, achieving breakthrough and exploitation faster than defending forces could reposition. The French response had been equally clear. Strengthen the Maginot Line, maintain defensive depth, preserve the army as a force in being rather than risk it in mobile operations. None of that doctrine had survived contact with reality. The Germans had gone around the Maginot Line through the Ardennes, a forest the French High Command had declared unsuitable for armor. German tanks had crossed the Meuse River at Sedan on May 13 while French artillery was still being repositioned to meet the threat. Within a week, German armored spearheads had reached the English Channel, cutting Allied forces in two. The French army had not collapsed from lack of courage or equipment. It had collapsed because German tactical innovation had rendered French defensive doctrine obsolete in less time than it took to redeploy a division. Dufour had spent the weeks since Sedan trying to understand what had gone wrong and more importantly what the Germans were doing right. He was a career officer who had graduated from Saint-Cyr in 1932, studied military theory under instructors who had fought at Verdun, and believed that warfare was ultimately a problem that could be solved through analysis and preparation. The German success was not magic. It was method. And method could be copied if you understood the underlying principles. The Stuka tactic was the clearest example. The aircraft itself was not particularly advanced. It was slower than French fighters, more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire than horizontal bombers, and carried a relatively small bomb load. But the way it was employed changed everything. The Stukas operated in direct communication with ground commanders, responding to requests for fire support within minutes rather than hours. They attacked point targets like bridges, artillery positions, and command posts with precision that heavy bombers could not match. And the psychological effect of the dive attack, the scream of the aircraft and the certainty of impact, disrupted defensive operations in ways that conventional bombing could not. Dufour had seen French bomber units attempt similar close air support missions. They flew level approach runs at medium altitude, vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and unable to achieve the accuracy needed for tactical targets. The doctrine was wrong, but the doctrine had been written before anyone understood how fast modern war could move. The German breakthrough at Sedan had been achieved by exactly this combination of armor and air support. Panzer divisions crossed the Meuse while Stukas suppressed French artillery positions on the opposite bank. When French reserves attempted to counterattack, they were hit by dive bombers before they could form up. The coordination was not perfect, but it was fast enough that French defenders never had time to establish a coherent defensive line. By early June, the French government was evacuating Paris. The British Expeditionary Force had withdrawn through Dunkirk. What remained of the French army was conducting a fighting retreat toward the Loire River, attempting to establish a defensive line that everyone knew would not hold. Dufour's unit, or what remained of it, had been attached to a composite infantry division that existed primarily on paper. They had no air support, limited artillery, and orders to delay German advance elements for as long as possible before withdrawing south. On June 12, those orders changed. Dufour was summoned to division headquarters, a farmhouse 10 kilometers south of Abbeville that had been a headquarters for approximately 6 hours and would cease to be a headquarters within the next 12. The division commander was Colonel Marchand, a veteran of the First World War who had spent the past month watching his division disintegrate under conditions he had never trained for and could not control. Marchand was 54 years old and looked 70. He had not slept in 3 days and had received orders from Corps headquarters that made no tactical sense but had to be executed anyway. "We are holding this sector for 48 hours, Marchand said, pointing to a map that showed German positions less than 15 kilometers away. Corps is establishing a new defensive line along the Bresle River. We buy them the time to dig in." Dufour studied the map, calculating approach routes and probable German dispositions. "We cannot hold for 48 hours without air support and reinforcement. The Germans will fix us in place and destroy us piecemeal." "I am aware of that, Captain. But orders are orders." Marchand paused, then continued in a lower voice. "However, if we are going to die here, we might as well make them pay for it. I want you to organize a harassment operation against their air support. Anything that disrupts their Stuka operations gives our withdrawal a better chance." It was not a realistic order. It was a desperate order from a man who understood they were out of options but refused to surrender without resistance. Dufour accepted it because the alternative was waiting in a ditch for German armor to arrive. He returned to his unit, 12 men who had survived the retreat from Sedan, and explained the mission. They would move north toward German forward positions, identify Stuka operating airfields, and attack them with whatever resources they could improvise. The men listened in silence. None of them believed they would survive. All of them agreed to try. Over the next 30 hours, Dufour's team moved through German-occupied territory using drainage ditches, tree lines, and abandoned farm buildings for cover. They observed German supply columns, identified patrol patterns, and located 3 temporary airfields where Stukas were refueling and rearming between missions. The airfields were not heavily defended. The Germans did not expect French ground forces this deep behind their lines. On the night of June 13, Dufour led 4 men to the smallest of the 3 airfields, a grass strip next to a captured French military depot. 6 Stukas were parked in a row, being serviced by ground crews under portable lighting. Dufour had no explosives, no heavy weapons, and no realistic chance of destroying the aircraft. But he had small arms and he understood that aircraft engines were complex machines that required maintenance. They opened fire from 200 meters, aiming for engine cowlings and fuel tanks. The initial burst killed 2 ground crew and sent the others diving for cover. Dufour's men fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition while maximizing disruption. They hit 3 aircraft before German security forces responded with machine gun fire. Dufour ordered withdrawal and they ran south through darkness, pursued by tracer fire that came close but failed to connect. The damage was minimal. 3 aircraft with engine damage, possibly reparable. 2 ground crew dead. The airfield operational again within hours. But Dufour had proven something important. German air superiority depended on forward operating bases that were vulnerable to ground attack if anyone was willing to attempt it. He reported this to Marchand the following morning. The colonel listened, then asked a question that changed everything. If we had dedicated units trained for this type of operation, could they disrupt German air operations systematically rather than as isolated incidents? Dufour considered the question carefully. With proper training, intelligence support, and mobility, yes. The Germans are extending their supply lines faster than they can secure them. Their airfields are temporary positions with minimal defense. A small unit with explosives and automatic weapons could inflict damage disproportionate to its size. Marchand made no immediate response. The division was withdrawing that afternoon, orders from Corps. The defensive line at Abbeville was collapsing. France was collapsing. Within days, possibly hours, the government would request an armistice. But Marchand was thinking past the immediate defeat to whatever came after. Write this down, he said. Everything you observed about German air-ground coordination. Their airfield security procedures. The timing of their operations. How they communicate between ground forces and air support. All of it. Someone needs to learn from this. Dufour wrote for 6 hours, producing a 20-page report that detailed every aspect of German tactical air operations he had observed since May 10. He described the Stuka dive attack profile, the radio coordination between forward air controllers and aircraft, the rapid refueling procedures that allowed quick turnaround times. He included diagrams of the airfield layout he had attacked and recommendations for how similar operations could be conducted more effectively with proper planning and resources. The report was completed on June 15. France requested an armistice on June 17. The fighting officially ended on June 25. Dufour's report disappeared into the chaos of military collapse, filed away in archives that were captured, burned, or scattered across a defeated nation. But certain documents have a way of surviving when they contain information someone needs. A copy of Dufour's report reached French officers in North Africa who were continuing resistance under General de Gaulle. It was translated and shared with British military intelligence in August 1940. By September, it was being reviewed by officers in the Royal Air Force who were defending Britain against German air attack and desperately seeking any tactical advantage. The British had their own experience with German air tactics. The Luftwaffe had conducted sustained bombing campaigns against British cities and military targets throughout the summer of 1940. RAF Fighter Command had developed effective defensive tactics, but the British had no equivalent to the Stuka, no doctrine for close air support integrated with ground operations. The French report provided a blueprint. In October 1940, the RAF established the first dedicated ground attack squadrons, equipped with aircraft modified for dive bombing and low-level strikes. The tactics were directly copied from German operations observed by French officers like Dufour. Aircraft would operate in direct communication with forward ground units, respond to specific target requests, and employ dive attack profiles to maximize accuracy against point targets. The first operational test came in North Africa in December 1940, when British forces launched an offensive against Italian positions in Egypt. RAF ground attack squadrons provided close air support using German-style coordination procedures. The results were immediate and decisive. British armor advanced faster than Italian forces could reposition, supported by airstrikes that disrupted defensive preparations exactly as German Stukas had done in France. The tactic spread. By 1941, American military observers were studying British ground attack operations and developing their own versions. The U.S. Army Air Forces created specialized ground attack units, trained pilots in dive bombing techniques, and established forward air controller positions with ground units. The fundamental concept remained the same: integrate air power with ground operations through direct communication and rapid response rather than pre-planned missions executed hours after requests. The Germans, ironically, never understood that their tactical innovations were being systematically copied and improved. They continued to employ Stukas through 1942, even as advancing Allied air defenses made the slow, vulnerable aircraft increasingly costly to operate. By 1943, the Stuka was obsolete, withdrawn from frontline service in all theaters except the Eastern Front where Soviet air opposition remained limited. But the tactical concept the Stuka represented, close air support integrated with mobile ground operations, had become fundamental to Allied doctrine. American fighter bombers in France during 1944 operated using procedures directly descended from German tactics observed in 1940. British ground attack squadrons in Italy employed coordination methods copied from Luftwaffe operations. Soviet Sturmovik aircraft supporting tank advances used German-style forward air control procedures learned through intelligence sharing with Western allies. Pierre Dufour survived the fall of France and joined Free French forces in North Africa in late 1940. He served with distinction through the North African Campaign, Italy, and the liberation of France, eventually reaching the rank of colonel. After the war, he learned that his report from June 1940 had been circulated among Allied air forces and contributed to the development of ground attack doctrine. In 1947, he was invited to speak at a conference on tactical air power at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. During his presentation, he was asked whether he felt vindicated that his observations had influenced Allied tactics. His response was recorded in the conference proceedings. "Vindication is the wrong word," he said. "We lost in 1940 because we failed to adapt while our enemy was innovating. The Germans showed us what modern war required. We were too slow to learn. The Allies learned faster, but they learned from our defeat. That is not vindication. That is simply how military evolution works. The side that copies successful tactics faster than the enemy can develop new ones will win. The Germans taught us that lesson in the worst possible way." The quiet copying of German tactical innovations represents one of the least discussed but most significant developments of World War II. The Germans entered the war with operational concepts refined through years of doctrinal development and combat testing in Spain and Poland. The Allies entered with doctrine largely unchanged since 1918. The gap should have been decisive. What prevented German victory was not Allied material superiority, which did not exist in 1940, but Allied institutional capacity to observe, analyze, and copy enemy innovations faster than the Germans could develop new ones. The Stuka tactic, with its integration of air and ground operations through direct communication and rapid response, was copied by the British by late 1940, adopted by the Americans by 1942, and improved through operational experience by 1943. The Germans, having invented the tactic, failed to recognize its limitations as air defenses improved and never developed adequate replacements until too late. By 1944, Allied ground attack aircraft were providing close air support with effectiveness that exceeded anything the Luftwaffe had achieved in 1940, using procedures and coordination methods directly copied from German operations and then refined through combat experience. This pattern repeated across multiple domains. German armored tactics were copied and improved by Soviet tank armies. German night fighter techniques were copied by RAF Bomber Command defensive systems. German assault gun employment was copied by American tank destroyer doctrine. In each case, the innovation originated with the Wehrmacht, was observed by Allied forces, analyzed through intelligence reports like Dufour's, and then copied and improved through systematic institutional learning. The lesson, uncomfortable for participants on all sides, was that tactical superiority in modern war is temporary. What matters is not who innovates first but who adapts fastest to enemy innovations. The Germans innovated brilliantly in the interwar period but adapted slowly once the war began. The Allies innovated less but adapted faster, copying what worked and discarding what did not with ruthless pragmatism. Pierre Dufour understood this because he had experienced both sides of the equation. He had watched French forces fail to adapt to German innovations in 1940. He had then participated in Allied forces that succeeded by systematically copying those same innovations and improving them through operational experience. The tactic was copied quietly because open acknowledgement of learning from the enemy was professionally and politically uncomfortable. But the copying happened anyway, because military organizations that refuse to learn from their enemies do not survive long enough to regret their pride. The report Dufour wrote in June 1940 was declassified in 1975. It sits now in French military archives, a 20-page document describing German tactical air operations with the clinical precision of someone who understood he was documenting the future of warfare. Historians who have reviewed it note that nearly every observation Dufour made was subsequently incorporated into Allied air-ground coordination doctrine. The tactic that devastated France in 1940 became the tactic that liberated France in 1944, copied quietly by officers who understood that winning wars matters more than protecting institutional pride. Thank you for listening. If you found this examination of tactical evolution valuable, please subscribe. We explore these forgotten dimensions of military history weekly, the innovations that changed warfare and the quiet processes through which they spread from enemy to ally and back again.